Welcome everybody to the second series on sustainability and the law. As always, sponsored by Queen Mary and the Society of Legal Scholars. We're very pleased today to have Andy Russell here, who will talk about the UK climate change adaptation policy, and specifically about sort of flood risk and coastal erosion. We'll have Dr. Franziska Arnold-Dwyer function as a discussant today. So first, Dr. Andy Russell, we're very pleased to have him. He is a lecturer in environmental science at Queen Mary, part of the School of Geography. He also has quite some experience in this as a civil servant, which is particularly relevant for the topic today, I think. He has worked on UK climate policy in the Committee on Climate Change. He has worked on international climate science in the Department for Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy, and International Biodiversity Evidence in the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. So we're very happy for him to be here. He has experience both the scientific side as well as the policy side. Our discussant today is our very own Franziska. She's a senior lecturer in insurance law and our specialism director in insurance law as well. She's also an experienced practitioner. She's worked over more than 10 years, I think, at Clifford Chance, and she's the author of the book Insurable Interest and the Law. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Andy. Andy, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Okay, thank you. Let me just share my screen. And it's this one. Can you see my slides? Yes, perfect. Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you for the introduction. Yep, I'm Andy Russell from the School of Geography, and I'll be talking about the UK climate change adaptation policy framework. Well, specifically the English climate change adaptation policy, but I won't get too much into the devolved administrations. So a little bit more on my background from the introduction. I was an academic at Brunel University for about 10 years before I left academia to go and work in the Committee on Climate Change for a few years. And then on a couple of big projects in DEFRA and BEIS before returning to academia to the brilliant Queen Mary. And I think that the highlight of my period in the civil service really was the Committee on Climate Change. It's an excellent organisation and it's hugely respected within the UK. I think it's the most highly cited organisation in Hansard, at least in the House of Lords, not sure about the Commons. And it's really well respected internationally. And when other countries build up their own Climate Change Act or similar, they use the Committee on Climate Change from the UK as a model quite often in that work. So the aims of what I want to go through well this evening, and thank you very much for coming along at 5 o'clock, are to look at the Climate Change Act and the Climate Change Committee that was set up as part of the Climate Change Act. I'll touch very briefly on climate change mitigation because that's a very big part of the Climate Change Act and the CCC's work. And it's also a nice counterpoint for climate change adaptation to see perhaps why climate change adaptation policies haven't developed as well as climate change mitigation. So then I'll talk about climate change adaptation, particularly looking at the climate change risk assessment, how that flows into the National Adaptation Programme, and then what the Committee on Climate Change does with its progress reports. And I'll look at a specific sector there with flood risk management. So the Climate Change Act 2008 is kind of most famous for the mitigation element. So the original act set a legal target to reduce UK greenhouse gas emissions by 80% relative to 1990 by 2050. And this requires government to set a carbon budget for 5-year periods up to that period. So there have been 6 so far, and that covers the period up to 2035. In 2019, the Act was amended so that the 80% target became a net 100% target. So this is net zero that we hear a lot about. So there will be net zero emissions by 2050 if we've achieved the aims of the Climate Change Act on the mitigation side. And that new net zero target was brought in response to the Paris Agreement. And already the targets, at least, are keeping up with that ambition. So the sixth carbon budget that goes up to the end of 2050 is aiming for a 78% reduction in emissions relative to 1990. So I think this, hopefully we all agree, is the really famous part of not only the Climate Change Act, but also the climate change narrative, the climate change discussion. So we emit greenhouse gases, that impacts climate, and we need to stop that. The part of the puzzle that doesn't get quite so much coverage is adaptation. So what are the climate change risks and what are we going to do about them? So within the Climate Change Act, there's a requirement for government to publish a climate change risk assessment every 5 years. The most recent one, well, the government's element of the most recent one was published this year, I think. I could be wrong there, I should check. And then the government has to publish a national adaptation programme that addresses those risks. So already, hopefully you can see that these aims aren't quite as quantified as the mitigation targets. And I'll talk to that in a few slides' time as well. So I think the reason this has been such a big success is there are clear legal obligations on a specific minister and its primary legislation. So those two aspects make sure it gets a lot of attention at the highest levels of government. So one of the other aspects of the Climate Change Act was setting up the Climate Change Committee, but I'll talk about that in a few slides. So let's think about mitigation. The UK has been really successful in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and I think the Climate Change Act has played a large part in that. And the Act has set out sort of these 4 pillars that I'll go over now of how climate change policy and climate change action should be developed. So there's a goal, and in terms of mitigation, that's the 2050 emissions target. There's a pathway of how to get to that goal. So every 5 years, there's a carbon budget that sets where we need to be to reach the ultimate aim of the Act. There's a toolkit. So the government is required to bring forward policies as part of the Act to meet the carbon budgets. And those are monitored by the Committee on Climate Change. So there's a lot of expertise in departments like BEIS to develop policies, and there's a lot of expertise in the Committee on Climate Change to advise on what those policies should be. One of the big criticisms of the Climate Change Act is that there are no penalties or very minor penalties for non-compliance, but I don't think that's unusual for legislation. In comparison, on adaptation, we're kind of stumbling around, making a bit of progress, but it's not as targeted. So the goal on the adaptation side could kind of be articulated as addressing the CCRA risks. There's no actual requirement within the Act to reduce climate change risks. They just have to be addressed, and that's open for interpretation. Then the pathway and the toolkit, I'm not really sure what these are in the analogy with mitigation. There's the National Adaptation Programme, but we'll see in a few slides' time that is deeply flawed and does not drive forward progress on climate change adaptation. And then finally, there is the Committee on Climate Change that does monitor progress and makes recommendations. But this has been quite a difficult process because the framework that the CCC is critiquing, the National Adaptation Programme, is not doing the job that it needs to do. So I'm being relatively critical about this framework, and it could be improved a lot, but adaptation is difficult. If we think about the targets you can set with mitigation, they're relatively easy to quantify and to come up with. You know, the 80% reduction, the 0% reduction, we know what the greenhouse gases are, we know where they come from. It's relatively easy to think about how you stop those emissions. For adaptation, it's very difficult. You know, how many do you set a target of the number of people you want to die each year from heat waves, or the number of people who are going to be flooded? Right, I suppose it would be the number of people you stop dying from heat waves. But it's difficult because the metrics, the way that you measure adaptation, is much more nebulous and messy than mitigation. So although I'm very critical, it is very hard as well, but that doesn't mean we couldn't be doing better. So the Committee on Climate Change, let's add some details to this side of the policy. So the Mitigation Committee advises the government on what each carbon budget should be and then scrutinises the progress on meeting that 2050 target. And the Adaptation Committee does something similar. It advises the government on the climate change risk assessment and then scrutinises the progress within the National Adaptation Programme. So the committee does largely the same things on both the mitigation and adaptation side, in that it almost writes a draft carbon budget or climate change risk assessment, and then the government decides how closely it wants its official carbon budget or CCRA to mirror the advice from the Committee on Climate Change. So the statutory roles under the Act are to provide independent advice on greenhouse gas emission reductions, on mitigation and the climate risks and opportunities for adaptation, and then to report to Parliament on the progress in meeting either emissions reductions or preparing for climate change. The opportunities they do appear in the climate change risk assessment, but they're much fewer and further between than the risks. And what do the committees look like? So there's the Mitigation Committee, has 8 members who meet monthly, and then a secretariat of around 20 technical experts who work full-time all year round. The current chair of the Mitigation Committee is Lord Deben, also known as John Gummer. So he was the UK's longest serving environment minister. So he was in government in the 90s and late 80s for MAF, the Ministry for Agriculture, Fisheries and Farms, famous for his response to the BSE crisis. And the Adaptation Committee has 6 members who meet monthly and a secretariat of around 5 technical experts. That committee is currently chaired by Baroness Brown, who's held really high-profile roles in engineering companies and academia in the past, notably for Rolls-Royce, where she used to work. I think the split of the expertise between these is a real problem. I said before that the mitigation work is relatively easy. It's just counting what's coming out of where and how much you need to reduce that by to meet the targets. Whereas the Adaptation Committee is essentially looking at our entire society and infrastructure and how it's constructed, what risks it faces, and how you can adapt it to be resilient to those risks in the future. So I mean, I think it's woefully underfunded and understaffed, the adaptation side, given the complexity of the work and the number of people who are at risk of climate risks in the future. So that's a real shame that's skewed that way towards mitigation. So a few slides on what we've achieved in mitigation. Again, there's a carbon budget every 5 years and the CCC monitors progress. And this slide really shows the big picture. So the black line is showing historic emissions, so what the UK domestic emissions have been like since 1990 and how they've reduced up to around 2018, when I think the most recent data were for this plot. And then the bars show what the carbon budgets are for the last 6 rounds. And the grey areas are the headroom for international aviation and shipping. So it's apt that that's a grey area on the plot, because it's also a grey area in the Act, whether or not international aviation and shipping should be included in the UK's domestic emissions. It is not explicit within the Act, but for carbon budget 6, the government has accepted that they should be included in the budget. So that's why the headroom has been removed for CB6. So you can see we're well on track after after missing CB1, carbon budget 1. We're well on track to meet carbon budget 3, and then hopefully with the net zero strategy, the carbon budgets in the future should be met as well. So how have we made that progress? And it's largely because of electricity supply and the move towards renewables. If you look at the yellow line on the left-hand side, there's about a 65% reduction in emissions from electricity over the last however many years that is, 20-ish years on that plot. You can also see recent dips in aviation and surface transport, and that's purely a blip from from COVID. So when the last analysis was done, we were just picking out the reduction in emissions from aviation and surface transport, and they will shoot back up. They already have. But you can see on the right-hand plot that whilst the bars showing the change from 2019 to 2020 were huge for those two sectors, the longer term average is much lower. So those are those diamonds nearer the zero line. And one of the other big successes has been the reduction in landfill emissions. So the landfill tax really impacted the stopping of biodegradable waste going to landfill, and that's taken out in other ways now. So for the future, the committee has also set out what needs to be done in the future to hit the net zero targets. And this big orange chunk in the left-hand graph is again about electrification of the system. So we're really relying on a lot of electricity being, a lot of renewable electricity being available in the future to meet our targets. The baseline goes up in the future, I think, because it assumes that there are no further climate change policies implemented from today, and there's some population growth in there as well, I'd expect. But the idea is that we get down to this blue line at the bottom, so it's 0 by 2050, and there's a plan of what needs to be done in different sectors to get there. And then the right-hand plot breaks that down even more, and here you can really see the net in net zero. So by 2050, the aviation, agriculture and land use lines are still significantly positive, but then the black line that goes into the negative is the emissions removals. So that's where you get to net zero by having a large section of removals in the system. So that's pretty much all I'm going to say about mitigation. So now on to the interesting bit about adaptation and the risks we face. So similarly, the CCRA happens every 5 years, and the National Adaptation Programme is published every 5 years. The only difference here is that the CCC monitors progress every 2 years and not every year. And this is a bit of a timeline of how this has worked over the last 10 years or so. So with the first climate change risk assessment, there was an evidence report in 2012. At that point, the Committee on Climate Change only reviewed some of the evidence going in because it had only just been set up. And then there was a National Adaptation Programme in 2013 that set out actions that would go out to 2017. And then the committee produced a progress report in 2015 that criticised the actions and said what needed to be improved, with a government response that then is supposed to build into the next climate change risk assessment evidence report, where the CCC was much more involved. They wrote a much more comprehensive set of recommendations for the government in 2016, which then turned into the government's climate change risk assessment in 2017, and so on. Then you have a second National Adaptation Programme actions, you have progress reports, government responses, and so on. There was another climate change risk assessment this year, and then that'll feed onto NAP3 in 2023. So it's actually a good time to be thinking about policy relevant research around climate change, because DEFRA will be writing the third National Adaptation Programme at the moment. Right, there we go. So what does a climate change risk assessment look like? So at a very high level, this is the sort of summary from the most recent climate change risk assessment. which, although I was involved in a lot of the underlying evidence, I didn't write the summary report, the executive summary. And to be honest, I don't like the way that they've summarized it. These risks that they've highlighted here are quite, when not abstract, but the DEFRA wanted something that was systems based. So I think the climate change committee advice that's gone in there has tried to look at how different stressors go across different receptors. So the first one, for example, is risk to the viability and diversity of terrestrial and freshwater habitats and species from multiple hazards. So that's not particularly clear what it's getting at. I much preferred the 2017 version, which is here, which is much more clear. So the risks that the UK faced were disaggregated much more clearly and reflect the potential damage or risk to life from the stressors or the climate variable, rather than looking at different climate variables impacting sectors. I think you get a more clear idea of what needs to be done from this type of framing of the risks. So in this framing, it's flooding and coastal change risks to communities and businesses and infrastructure that come out as the top risk, and risks to health, well-being and productivity from high temperatures, which, if you look at the underlying evidence of the most recent climate change risk assessment, are the biggest climate drivers of risks. But the way they've framed the articulation of the risks with a sectors and systems approach kind of gets lost in the mix. So up to this point, the Climate Change Act, as far as adaptation is concerned, has been relatively successful. We've done a comprehensive assessment of all the risks that exist, and then that goes to DEFRA to develop a national adaptation programme. But this is where it kind of falls apart. Certainly NAP1, the minister at the time, Owen Paterson, was not particularly interested in the national adaptation programme. And by 2018, I think that there wasn't any improved enthusiasm for it. So what tends to happen with the national adaptation programme is it writes hundreds of actions, but none of them directly address risks and none of them directly reduce risks. What the actions tend to be are things like publish a policy statement or update a data set or refresh some plans that already exist or update a strategy. So there's lots of stuff that falls out of the NAP, but none of it directly addresses or reduces risks, which was my big criticism of the National Adaptation Programme, when it could have been a brilliant umbrella strategy to bring together other policy strategies and plans to have a clear vision of how we reduce risk into the future. I think the government departments have potentially viewed it as something that it has to do, but it doesn't want to create more work, which sort of means that the whole thing is largely pointless. And then when we get to progress reports, which is what the committee turns out to criticise the National Adaptation Programme, what we were doing there was trying to categorise these different policies in terms of the progress that they've made in managing risk and the quality of the plan for the future. So the green boxes around the bottom, particularly 9, would be there's a good plan and we're making progress towards addressing risks, and there's nothing in that green box. There's far more in the red and orange boxes where there's a poor plan and no progress is being made. So our summary in 2019 of the high level progress was that the government has failed to increase adaptation policy ambition and implementation through its latest NAP, despite the increasing urgency and addressing of the risks that are underlying all this from climate change. So maybe it'll help to flesh this out, to look at a specific sector. So let's have a look at flood risk management. Again, we've got brilliant data here. So the climate change risk part of the problem is going really well. So this is one figure from the most recent climate change risk assessment evidence report. And this uses some sort of statistical model to extrapolate flood risk into the future based on certain assumptions around the level of climate change and population change. And I know it's really hard to see the details, but the high level messages would be in the 2080s with 4 degrees of climate change, which is still possible, and high population growth, we're looking at a sort of trebling of overall flood risk when you articulate in terms of damages to property. And that's split down by the different types of flooding as well. And there are different scenarios. So we can look at 2 degrees of climate change. We can look at low population growth. We can look at how the adaptation policies change. But the message is that climate change is going to increase into the future and risk will increase, and we need to be doing something about that. So, well, what are my specific criticisms of flood and coastal erosion risk management policies? So we've already covered this one, that there's no clear target or ambition for FCERM policies. And that would be so easy to do for flooding. It is quite difficult for other areas of adaptation, but flooding, it could be done. It just isn't. The National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy doesn't address coastal erosion very well. And I think coastal erosion is going to be a big problem for the future. It's a ticking time bomb. Although there's not that much risk at the moment, there's potentially a lot building up in the system. And that said, though, we have poor data on historical losses to coastal erosion. There are very poor projections of future coastal erosion rates. And the losses to coastal erosion can't be compensated or insured against. And there's no requirement to check for risk when buying a property. Mortgage lenders might insist on it, but you could very easily be a cash buyer of a property on the edge of a cliff and no one would ask you to look at what the risk was from coastal erosion. There's overly complex governance, surface water flooding, so the kind of flooding you get from really heavy, intense downfalls where the sewage system gets overwhelmed and the floodwaters rise in urban areas. That's difficult because it falls between departments, agencies and local authorities. And the value of interventions is very poorly calculated. So I'll go through these one by one very quickly, just to give you an idea of what these problems look like. So for targets, they're very often vague and they're not SMART, so specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-bound. So the 25-year environment plan spoke about reducing the risk of harm to people from flooding. I mean, that means nothing. You could measure harm in many different ways and still not be able to come up with a way of working out whether you've achieved that aim or not. And they tend not to be evidence-based. So the latest funding settlement for flood risk management in the UK wants to better protect 336,000 properties by 2027. But there's no underlying evidence as to why 336,000, which properties and how much better protected. And again, that would be easy to do. You could start at the bottom, work out who was at risk, who it would be cost beneficial to protect, and then aim to do that rather than starting with what are the Treasury willing to give for flood risk management, how many properties could we probably protect with that, and then setting that as the target. So I think my question is, are we really addressing the risks we face? And that's something that I'm hoping to look at in a British Academy Innovation Fellowship that I've recently been awarded, to look at the policies, to talk to policymakers and experts, and then develop a suite of quantified evidence-based flood risk management targets that we could engage policymakers in DEFRA with to talk about. On coastal erosion, I mean, this area really upsets me. There's a lot of people who are facing a lot of risk, and there's not a safety net for them. So we did a big project on this at the committee in 2018, where we looked at the assets that are at risk. We reviewed the policy framework, and we performed a cost-benefit analysis of something called the shoreline management plans to see what we should be doing. I'll skip through this quite quickly because it's relatively technical, but we used GIS type mapping to look at the flood zones and the properties that are at risk. So we looked at flooding as well in this report. And then you count the number of properties that are in those risk bands. And and it's quite high for flooding. So present day around just under 500,000. And then if you look to the future, that increases to about 1.2 million. And then the expected annual damages goes up even more. So this is a very poor situation that we're not managing very well. And we also showed that we can minimize I'll skip this because it's going to take me so long to explain it. But thinking about coastal erosion, so here's a picture of the kind of properties and the kind of risk that these properties face. So coastal flooding is where the water comes onto the land where it shouldn't be. Coastal erosion is where the sea brings the land into the sea, it eats away at it, and anything that happens to be on the cliff edge falls off. So these properties have been completely destroyed by the coastal erosion, and the ones further back are next, and it won't be long before they're gone as well. So similarly, we looked at a map of the best projections of coastal erosion. So very simply, where it's red, that's bad, where it's green, it's not so bad. And then calculated the number of different assets that fall within the area of cliff that's going to recede to where there's currently a property. And as you can see in the top line, for the present day, this is pretty low. It's around 3,000 to 5,000 properties that are at risk of falling off a cliff. But in the future, so the top right-hand corner of this table, I mean, this number can get up to 160, 170,000 if you assume a high level of climate change and that we don't understand how cliffs always erode, which we don't. So there's a huge underlying, unassessed and unplanned for level of risk here. And as I said, coastal erosion is horrible because it's a complete loss. You can't dry your house out. It's fallen off the cliff into the sea. It's gone. And then the governance. So looking at flood risk management in general, there are loads of policies and strategies and plans, as well as the primary legislation that goes back to the 1940s that governs this area. So this little plot is trying to show all the relevant policies and plans to flood risk management and the time periods that they're active for. So this is the 25-year environment plan, the National Adaptation Programme, the NIC, National Infrastructure Assessment, the long-term investment strategies for flood risk, and then the FSERM strategy, flood RE's lifetime, the shoreline management plans, the flood risk management plans, and so on. And they all cover different spatial and temporal scales, and they're not designed to interact with each other. The Flood and Water Management Act in 2010 was supposed to clarify this, but it didn't. It failed in that aim, and we're left with this melange of different policies and strategies that aren't aligned, some of which aren't statutory. So there's a big problem here. And we looked at this for coastal management, and then looked at the organizations that are involved as well. And there are particular weak spots in the policy frameworks as well. So for coastal erosion and coastal flooding, you've got this problem where the local planners are relying on the shoreline management plans as a result of the national policy planning policy framework to look at the shoreline management plans. But the shoreline management plans are non-statutory, so things that are in there aren't going to happen, but the local planners are assuming that they will because they've been told to by the NPPF. Am I running out of time? Shall I speed up a bit?
I think this is fine. Please.
Okay, I've only got a few more slides, so
well, go ahead. No worries. We have plenty.
Okay. So when there's a particular problem with surface water flooding, as I mentioned before, and that the reason for that is river and coastal flooding are explicitly the responsibility of the Environment Agency. That was in the Water Resources Act 1991. But surface water flooding was a bit of a mess in the Land Drainage Act, where it falls to the responsibility of local authorities who don't have the expertise or the resources to deal with it properly. So while some of these strategies are supposed, in principle, address surface water flooding, they don't actually have any responsibility to address those things. And then these surface water management plans And surface water action plans, again, like the NAP, don't address risks directly. So we assessed those in 2019 and ruled those out. And then you're left with 152 lead local flood authority local flood risk management strategies that are supposed to be dealing with surface water flooding, but no one's ever been through them to check what's in there. So who knows if that risk is being addressed properly. I had a master's student go through them all this the last couple of months, and we tried to audit those, but we still don't know if those actions are happening. We've got some confidence that there are some good things in there. So there are targets, they're quite often smart, and surface water flooding is mentioned, but there are some worrying things in there as well. There's no monitoring and framework, no monitoring and evaluation frameworks, climate change scenarios weren't used, and population change was very rarely considered. And the final point I'll talk about, which I think will lead on to Franziska's talk, is that the value of interventions. So one really good example here is, are we making good planning decisions? So this graph shows the proportion of all new addresses created within flood zone 3, which is, I can't remember the exact detail, but you would call it within the floodplain. So this is still on average around 8% of addresses every year are within the floodplain. Now that's not necessarily a problem because London is a floodplain, but it's very well protected. So it's still described as flood zone 3, but it's unlikely to flood because there's protection. So this is worrying in that it's high and growing, but it could be managed if there were proper policies in place. What is more worrying is the number of planning permissions that were granted against Environment Agency advice. So from sort of 2011 through to 2017, there's at least 100, sometimes up to 1,400 new residential units that are being given planning permission against the Environment Agency's advice. And as we'll hear about in the insurance situation, that's a real problem. So I'll wrap up now with some conclusions. I mean, on paper, England has an excellent climate change adaptation policy framework. It's well thought through, it's logical, it should work. The problem is it's let down by poor implementation of the National Adaptation Programme. So if you don't put the right actions in the National Adaptation Programme, then the climate change risk assessment and the Committee on Climate Change progress reports are largely pointless. So as a result, the overarching climate change adaptation ambitions don't exist, and the targets, goals and policies are distributed suboptimally across a range of organisations, scales and documents. And I think this is something that we could address and we should address. So I'll finish there.
Thanks so much, Andy. This is super interesting. Franziska, we have a lot of questions in the chat, but perhaps Franziska, you can first do your presentation, and then we'll go to this.
Well, I can keep it short, but maybe I just we said a few things that follow on from what Andy said. So if I just share my slides. Okay, I'm just gonna minimize that. Right, so one area where I think some action has been taken is in relation to flooding, where sort of the action has been sort of partially outsourced to the insurance industry. Now, the insurance industry can't stop flooding itself, but it can help households to address the financial consequences of flooding. And the insurance industry is also a repository of an enormous wealth of risk management and just sort of risk adaptation expertise and knowledge, which can be sort of usefully sort of brought to bear in relation to what in the insurance industry is called natural catastrophe risk, of which flooding is one. So I'm just gonna talk about very briefly how flooding has been addressed. First of all, there is this an interesting website which I'm not sure I can open. I won't open it now, but it's basically a government website where you can type in your postcode and you can find out how much at risk your property is where you live. And I've tried it out for Queen Mary's Mile End campus, and you'll be pleased to hear that it's a very low risk, so you don't need to get your values out. So when we're looking at flood risks, what does it mean specifically? Where it puts people's life and health at risk. There's risk to residential and business property and infrastructure. And then once you've got property damage, there will also be business losses, loss of profits due to business interruption. Livestock can be damaged and whole habitats can get damaged as well. So flood insurance is, as I said, cannot stop the flood itself, but it can indemnify for loss or damage to property caused by floods. And it has been estimated that in England alone, over 5 million properties are at risk of flooding. Now, there is a problem with insuring against flood risks. Which is that for most households, flooding is seen as a risk that occurs relatively infrequently, but when it does, it causes a lot of damage. And there are lots of empirical studies about people's behavior when they buy insurance. And one of the findings is that if people think that a risk is relatively low, then they don't want to spend the extra premium and they don't buy insurance. This can lead to something that's called adverse selection, where only those people who are at high risk of flooding are likely to buy flood insurance. And this is then a bad insurance situation, because insurers are basically only taking on bad risks. And the whole idea of mutualizing risk, of pooling risk, and so you take on lots of different risks, and the hope is that the premium of the many will pay for the losses of the few, is no longer going to work. And then this in turn causes issues for insurers who will find it difficult to reinsure. So that means these risks can become uninsurable, in either that insurers will no longer offer that kind of insurance, or that the premium is so high that people can't afford it. But yet in the UK, over 94% of property insurers offer flood insurance, and the majority of homeowners in the UK have flood insurance. And the reason that is so is that in the UK, we have a model where flood insurance is bundled into people's home and property insurance. So it's part of a package. And this way, mortgage lenders can be satisfied that flood insurance is available. And you don't, it's not separately priced, and there's no opt-out available. So you basically address this adverse selection issue that I mentioned. And so just to give you an example of what it looks like in a policy wording, this is from, I'm not advertising Aviva, but this is just from Aviva home insurance policy. And there will be a section addressing what in relation to the building is insured and what's not insured. And you can see, I don't know whether I've got a pen. Here's a pen. You can see here that it insures storm and flood risks. So that doesn't really, however, answer the question how insurers are dealing with it. They're still at risk because they now have the flood risk on their books. And as we've seen from floodings, especially sort of in the west of England, the River Severn seems to be prone to flooding quite frequently. This can lead to enormous losses. And the answer to this problem has been that that the UK government, together with the UK insurance industry, has set up a scheme which is called the Flood Risk Scheme, and it's set up under the Water Act 2014 Part 4. And the idea is that Flood Re is basically a not-for-profit reinsurer that offers reinsurance at subsidized prices to those insurers that have taken on flood risk. Now, how is this subsidized premium funded? It's funded by a levy paid by all UK insurance companies that offer property insurance. And of course, they will want to pass on that levy that they are paying, any premium they are charging to people who want to buy property insurance. But it's in that way, it's sort of shared out in a relatively even and fair way. So it's not just that homeowners that are at high risk pay a very high premium. Everyone is paying sort of a contribution towards it. So as a result of this reinsurance scheme, property insurers can offer homeowner property insurance at affordable premium to all householders, even if the property is located in a flood-prone area. And since April this year, this flood risk scheme has now been supplemented with something that's called Buildback Better initiative, which then enables flood victims to repair their homes with flood resilience and resistance measures. So once there is a claim, the insurance will pay out, but they can also claim up to £10,000 for flood resilience measures over and above the cost of any work or repair that's being done. And what kind of measures might that be? Well, it's of really basic things for flood-proofing your property, having in sort of your basement area, having sort of electrical sockets above a certain heights, replacing flooring with waterproof tiling and grouting, etc. So there are a number of measures that can be sort of put in to flood-proof properties. Now, Flood Re has been in operation for 6 years, and on the positive, sort of on the plus side, it's a good scheme for giving flood insurance cover to everyone who needs it. The Buildback Better initiative is a positive step towards sort of actually taking adaptation action. It has reduced the premium of households that had prior claims. And it's run in a way that doesn't impose an additional financial liability for the UK government, because the way it's financed is through this levy on insurers, who will then pass it on as sort of via the premium payments. However, it's not without its critics. One of the criticisms that has been made is that by offering flood insurance at reasonable prices, even to householders that live in flood areas, doesn't necessarily incentivize policyholders to take flood prevention measures. And sort of partially, this is now being sought to address with this Buildback Better initiative. But also it has been criticized, especially by the insurance industry, that part of the bargain of taking part in this flood risk scheme, of the implicit bargain was always that the UK government would also do more, invest more into risk prevention measures. And for the first few years of the flood risk scheme, nothing seems to be happening. But just sort of earlier this year, I found commitments from press releases from the government committing to 5.2 billion funding for flood and coastal erosion defenses to be spent between 2021 and 2027. And as Andy mentioned, unfortunately, house building schemes in flood-prone areas are still going ahead. So that's so unless they're built in a way that deals with that makes them flood-proof, that's not great. And another limitation of the flood-free scheme is that it only applies to private homes. It does not apply to business premises. So if you have, I don't know, if you have a business, a factory, a shop, a garage close to a river prone to be flooding, your premiums may still be very, very high. The flood-free scheme is also only intended to be a temporary scheme to run at until 2039, and by then the UK property market is intended to have moved to make itself flood-proof and also to then go back to risk-reflective premium pricing. Now, just very, very briefly, by way of comparison, the UK flood-free scheme is very different to what other countries have done. In the US, there's a scheme called the National Flood Insurance Program, where basically the government, the US government, subsidizes a scheme to give eligible homeowners flood cover at reasonable premium prices. So they are directly subsidizing homeowners most at risk. And then in France, there's also a government-backed scheme where again, flood cover is bundled into homeowner property insurance sold by private insurers. But then the government, basically, the French government sort of undertakes to provides state-sponsored reinsurance. And the whole scheme depends on the French government declaring a catastrophe naturelle. And it's only then that this particular law bites, and the French government will then reinsure insurers who've paid out claims for flood losses. And then a third model is Germany, and it's not often you associate Germany with a free market approach, but in this case it is. Here flood coverage is optional and add-on, so the government doesn't subsidize premiums. And basically the idea is that that you shouldn't buy property in areas, shouldn't buy or build property in areas that are at risk of flooding, or if you do, you need to make it flood-proof. However, there were very heavy floods in the west of Germany last summer, with loss of lives and lots of property damage. And this has ignited a fresh debate on whether flood insurance should be obligatory and whether there should be a complete ban on new developments in the sort of areas that are at the highest risk of flooding. So that's all from me. And I'm sure you've got lots of questions for Andy, but if you have any flood insurance questions, then I'm also available. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Franziska. I think Andy has already very efficiently answered some of the questions in the chat, which is great time management wise, so thanks for that. Maybe I'll just raise, I think one of the first questions that was asked in the chat for Andy. With the increased reliance on renewable power generation, how will the issue of intermittency be addressed? I'm assuming the intermittency between sort of generation of power.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not my area of expertise, the mitigation and particularly the energy side of things, but my understanding is it's batteries. We need really good batteries to store energy when it's abundant, and to be used at different times. And there are some innovative approaches to that, like using electric vehicle batteries to store energy when it's abundant, and then to push that back into the house when it's needed. Yeah, I don't know too much about these things, but I think there's some pretty smart solutions being developed.
Yeah, we'll have to ask Elon Musk to develop a world battery for us.
Send him a treat.
And I'll send him some chocolates after the seminar. We have a long question from Bryony in the chat. I don't know, Bryony, if you want to open your microphone and raise a question yourself.
I guess it cut me off before I even wrote the question. So, I mean, I was picking up on the flooding, but we should be thinking about flooding, overheating, subsidence, all of these things, because you can do one action to adapt on one, and it can have maladaptation effects on the others. But I guess my question is, there's always this focus on insurance, but insurance does not equate to adaptation. And I guess my question to the speakers is, what should be happening at a property level with regard to what the UK government is able to do, perhaps through land registry and other mechanisms it has, and what should be left to the market to do? And my understanding is that government partly should be stepping in where there's a market lag, and I think there's going to be less of a lag now with TCFD coming in, but I think that the adaptation actions and the cash flow to do that will happen with the larger organizations, the larger landlords, the larger sort of more prestige property developers. But what happens to the vast majority of homes which are in a poor state of repair, and now with people feeling the increasing pinch and don't have the cash flow? So I guess that's my question. I don't think insurance is the right way, because they're not incentivized really for adaptation. So what are your alternative suggestions for the small scale homeowner and resident in properties where you've got maybe landlords that have one or two properties, they're not commercial landlords?
Do you want to take that, or shall I kick off with something? And so yeah, I agree that insurance isn't the answer. In fact, flood re doesn't cover properties built after 2009. So the assumption in the system is that properties built in the last 13 years and forever in the future are resilient to flooding if they are built in areas of flood risk. So that would be either they're built behind some sort of protection, or there is some form of property level resilience, like floodgates or water repellent, or materials that dry out much more quickly. So ways that the property can bounce back from being flooded. So yeah, it's definitely not the answer, particularly for new properties. Franziska, did you want to come in as well?
Yeah, thanks for this really good question, Bryony. One thing I would say on insurance, I think there is an alignment of interest in adaptation, because whilst insurers love to have your premium, they don't like paying out claims. So it's very much in their interest to sort of future-proof and minimize claims in the future. And I think this is partly what this Buildback Better scheme is trying to capture. So when there is a flood claim and the property is being repaired, it's not just repaired, sort of mended, but it's repaired in a way to make it more flood-proof.
I guess that's the thing, though, with adaptation, you hope that you don't get to the point where the event actually occurs. So yes, the insurers step in at the point you've actually got a flood risk, or maybe they do or don't.
Yeah, but what you're saying is the water shouldn't reach the property in the first instance.
Yes, and then if we're just focused on insurers, I think there's probably more to be done with the mortgage system and green loans and things like that, particularly as people be even tighter with cash flow coming up.
Absolutely, yeah.
We have, and I'm aware of time, so perhaps the last question from you, David.
You're on mute, David.
Oh, sorry. You might You might have preferred if I kept on mute when you hear this question. But thanks for both. They were great, really informative, really interesting presentations. I mean, I've got loads and loads of questions actually, particularly about government policy and where this is going. But it just struck me that you're both identifying a very kind of deceptive calculus. I mean, not that you're deceiving us, that underlying what you're talking about is a very, very deceptive calculus. So in the mitigation side, which of course Andrew was talking about a lot, the deception is the deception of net zero. So we've got in January 2 new oil and gas fields coming on stream and 6 more in February. And there was one up in production last month in just off Norfolk, a gas field. And of course, what enables that is a net zero calculus, that these will be offset. And some of the calculations are future projections about carbon capture and so on, right? So I think there's a fundamental deception there that we are all sleepwalking through, that we need to kind of unpick, because it speaks to the second part, the adaptation, the insurance, and another form of deceptive calculus, which is, of course, that nobody who caused this, and it's very difficult to identify, of course, who caused this if we're talking about individual firms or groups of investors and so on, but those who profit the most, let's say, and some of those are investors who will gain from all of these new oil and gas fields that are coming on stream, are having their external effects absorbed by this very complex adaptation policy. So to me, that there are maybe more fundamental questions than you could ever answer here, but I'm listening to you thinking this is an entirely deceptive problem we've got, that the insurance industry is expected to, and I'm not being too sympathetic to the insurance industry, but they are expecting to pick up and absorb and repackage all of those kind of externalities in the same way that the government is kind of going along with as well. So I suppose my question is there a way in which we can use our observations from this to challenge the deception, the real deception that's taking us into a very difficult position where it's very difficult to get out of this?
I'm not sure where to start. I suppose what I was thinking when Bryony was asking her question is that risk-wise, we are never going to get to zero. In fact, it will go up. There is not a suite of assumptions of the future that means that the number of people that are flooded and the amount of damage that is caused is going to go down. Floods will happen, people will lose their homes, they will suffer severe mental health outcomes as a result of that. Properties will fall off cliffs. And I wonder if that's part of the reason that adaptation ambitions are never articulated, because they would be very depressing. A feasible, plausible flood risk management ambition might be, we do not want expected damages in 2080 to more than double. That's not going to get many people excited. So I wonder if that's part of the reason why it doesn't happen. Yeah, and I don't think I presented many of the data on those projections. So yeah, that could have been a different talk on all the risks that we face, and that net zero is not going to get us out of it. It might reduce the level of catastrophe a little bit, but we still need to adapt. That's all I've got. Did you have anything to add, Franziska?
To that, I'd add that I think, if I understand David correctly, that there is a moral hazard sort of issue in that if we deal with adaptation, we learn to live with the crisis rather than addressing the crisis. Is that what you're getting at, David?
Kind of.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to follow up with another question. But I mean, I just mean that there's a kind of level of difficulty in accounting for the true costs of what's happening here that was Andrew just articulated, that, I'm certainly not arguing that we have to reach absolute zero, because that's impossible, right? But to recognize that net zero is a deception, and to recognize that the possibility of ensuring these in ways that distribute the cost fairly is also a kind of deception. So how do we get beneath that to try and be real about this problem? Because for me, to start off with the point I made, stopping producing new oil and gas now, it's not just me that's saying it, it's the International Energy Authority. So if we don't do that, we're looking at 2, 3, who knows, 4 degrees, rather than managing to try and keep it as low as possible.
Let's hope that will give us some courage to tackle the future. Before we, first of all, thanks so much, Andy. Thanks so much, Franziska. I think this has been very, very interesting, and I really enjoyed the conversation. I think we could go on for another hour or so. So that speaks for itself. So thanks so much for joining. Before we let you go, we would like to say a few words, and perhaps Franziska, you can introduce the competition for us.
I think it speaks to to David's point. What can we do? And so we are actually running a student competition, which is to ask and also others, not just law students, but how can lawyers play a role in advancing the sustainable agenda? And what contributions can students make to a sustainable law school? So we're interested in thoughts on those 2 topics. This should be, your thoughts should be in the form of a very short essay, no more than 500 words, outlining your thoughts and ideas, and submitted to us by 5th of September. So we extended the deadline, realizing that our earlier deadline was clashing with exams. So please do send in your thoughts, and the winner will be announced and honored later on in September this year at another event we're organizing. And this is also supported with funding from the Society of Legal Scholars. So thank you very much, and we're looking forward to receiving your submissions.
Okay, great. Well, I think that ends the session. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining. We'll post our next seminar via the normal channel. So we're very keen to see you all again. Then thanks so much, Andy. Thanks, Franziska. This has been great. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you.